He's here. Whoa! Let me get another beat.
Third strike. Fight for the future.
God, I love Third Strike. The characters, the music, the speed, the mechanics, all of it. This game is just so much fun. I mean, as a fighter, like, does it have its problems? Yeah, sure, but I just can't help but keep coming back to this game. Out of every fighting game that I've played or tried to be a part of, Third Strike is just my absolute favorite. And honestly, it's probably just one of my favorite games in general. But anyway, who is this strange internet man, and why does he keep talking about Third Strike? Well, hey, I'm GD, this is my channel, and this is a show that I've started called
Enemy Comin,
which hopefully I can use to introduce more people to games that I love, namely some that might be kind of hard to break into, talk about some arcade culture, and even build some fun projects along the way. And B, I love Third Strike because and it would just be so sick if I could do something to get people to enjoy it as much as I do.
I can't. But you got half of it. That was really good.
It's not enough. And that's really the heart of this whole scheme here. The newest Street Fighter is out, has been for a while, and in all honesty, it's gotten a lot better since it first launched. But I still just love Third Strike so much more. With Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection lining the shelves of your local shopping center, we are currently living in a timeline where Third Strike can be someone's first Street Fighter game. Right now has never been a better time to get into Third Strike, but Third Strike isn't exactly known for being the easiest game around to get into and stick with. I couldn't help but think maybe I can do something to help introduce more people to the game. The new collection itself doesn't actually come packaged with any kind of how-to, tutorial, whatever. The only things listed are some of the special moves, really. All the legacy players got good without walkthroughs and how to play, sure, but we have the technology, we can do a little bit better. There is tons and tons of information out there, but most of it is either still in all text formats, some of which aren't even completely accurate, or a lot of the old combo videos and important match footage is so old, it feels like they have someone in a darkroom somewhere splicing the film together by hand before it goes up on YouTube. Then if you actually do your research and start digging around and track down some old forum for Third Strike, you'll find someone out on page 22 saying, oh, you want to play a good queue? You want to see some good queue play? You have to watch this video. This is the best video at the best quality. And then they expect you to get excited like, oh, 240p this time, sick! But really, those old recordings are actually super valuable. And there are a few great figureheads out there right now making really good, modern stuff for Third Strike, and I'll definitely bring them up again. Although I'm hoping to make something that's actually really comprehensive for Third Strike, telling you a little bit about the history of the game, kind of briefly going over some of the history of Street Fighter in general. We're gonna talk about some really important competitive bits in other Street Fighters that I kind of feel heavily influenced why a lot of things work the way they do in Third Strike, all before I go into a fully fledged pick up and play how-to for Third Strike. That way you can actually work along with me and really get your hands dirty with the game. And hopefully that helps, since Capcom decided it was the best idea to not give any form of how-to in the newest port. If Third Strike or 30th Anniversary is your very first Street Fighter, well, first off, welcome to Street Fighter, happy to have you. But hopefully this video is the thing that you can use to start with. We'll touch on some arcade industry history, some advanced Third Strike concepts, some really old, useful techniques, and then hopefully wrap up with a bunch of resources to get you out there and playing with other people. Sound good? Well, let's start talking about some Street Fighter.
Turret 1. This is gonna be a match to remember.
First things first, gotta get a little base knowledge down. Third Strike is one of the big three commonly played / discussed old school Street Fighter games. But GD Alpha 3 is in my anniversary collection. That one has the online. Isn't that the important one in the Alpha lineup? Shh. Hey. Shut up. I'm gonna talk about that, but Street Fighter Alpha 2 is actually pretty important to Third Strike, so just stick with me on this. Let's just go ahead and run through Street Fighter through the years. The original Street Fighter. Is it beautiful? No. Does it sound good? No. Is it competitive? Well, you know, it's kind of funny that you would ask that. When you ask that, it's competitive. On Earth, you can look at me and then say, oh, this fireball shoots 8% of my health. But then you go off and say, and then go off and say, yes. But maybe not in the way you might be thinking. Being an arcade game, it actually took money to keep playing. Street Fighter, even though it didn't start as the giant that it is today, really improved on the mentality of taking yours and your friends' quarters in the arcade space. Not a great game, sure, but a super important stepping stone in the arcade industry. The multitudes of Street Fighter II, spanning from 1991 all the way to 1994. These games sparked the first real competitive boom for Street Fighter. Super Street Fighter II Turbo, or more often referred to as Super Turbo, ST, 2X, or even Grandmaster Challenge, is still to this day played at major tournaments every single year. It's another Street Fighter that I absolutely love to death, and you should definitely make sure you give this one a try at some point too. On to a couple of the alpha games. The mainline arcade alphas and some spin-off games went up to around 1996. The alpha games took the art style in a completely different direction, and it wasn't really until Alpha 2 came around the arcade that people really started to care for it. The gameplay in Alpha 2 really is what sold it. Compared to Alpha 1, it was just the right speed, had new mechanics that functioned just right to make some really great back and forth pacing. Even at some of the upper levels of play, it just has a really fun flow to it. Finally, we work our way up to 1997, where Capcom graced us with Street Fighter 3, New Generation. And, it kinda sucked. Second Impact came out not even an entire year after New Generation dropped. And if we're being honest, the modern equivalent of these new games would be like a big DLC package today. And I really only make that comparison since there really wasn't much of a way to update these arcade games otherwise. That's just kind of how business used to operate in arcades. You'll actually find a few people here and there that will say that Second Impact is actually a pretty good title. And you know what? They're really not wrong. For what it is, it's a pretty fun game. I'll be a little bit biased here and say that I think one of the biggest reasons why I agree with that, it's mostly just because I love Third Strike so much. If you hand said dumb internet man Third Strike minus, you can kind of predict the result. Multiple other good titles were released after this, but we wouldn't actually see Third Strike in the arcade until 1999. You know, actually, for the most part, this is really where the big gap in the Street Fighter series begins. There were a few games in between, Capcom Fighting Jam, but nothing that really got the masses back into punching people again until Street Fighter 4 revived the entire fighting game genre. A little side note, this is why whenever you see people say, "Oh, Niner" every now and again, they're referring to someone who got into Street Fighter or fighting games when Street Fighter 4 came out, since there was a really big boom of new players. But I mean, don't let that stuff mean anything. I mean, technically I'm an 09er too, so... Yeah, but you're playing Blaze Blue. You didn't even have Extend. You just played Blaze Blue. You started with Blaze Blue. We don't talk about that here, let's just get to Alpha 2. Competition in Alpha 2 was strong, with some people still sticking around Super Turbo, or even playing some of the Capcom side games like Darkstalkers for their competitive fix. Vampire Savior is also really good. Please plug up your 360 and or PS3 and purchase Resurrection. Thank you. The point is, fighting games were alive and well right now, and each respective game was deep enough into their lifespans to be, at least in my opinion, the best that their series would get. Alpha 2 had lots of good sticking points in its mechanics that laid some great groundwork for titles to come. All of your standard fighting game apparel is accounted for, life bars for each player, best of X rounds to win, usually out of 3, topped off with the refillable super meter for busting out those flashy super moves. The really important bits in Alpha 2 though are the variable super moves, alpha counters, and custom combos. Like most fighting games, super moves are done by inputting a specific series of inputs on the joystick and then hitting a button. But in Alpha 2, the super meter was actually cut up into 3 different sections. Here's the super after we hit just one button. And now 2. And here's all 3. Now did you see the super meter? Hitting just one button only used up the first chunk, while saving the rest of it. Hitting all three used all three chunks and did a lot more damage. This let players strategize their meter expenditure. Do I want to save it all up and use it for one huge damage move? Or should I just use up one little super at a time and just kind of chip away at my opponent? Alpha counters gave players another really fun way to use up that meter. You ever been playing a fighting game with one of your friends and all they do is just put you into the corner and they never let you breathe? After you block an attack, you can do the alpha counter motion and either press a punch for a high counter, or kick with a low counter. This kind of gave players a way to aggressively defend against other players who weren't really big fans of letting them have a turn. This one kind of explains itself. Activating a custom combo lets you chain or link attacks that wouldn't normally connect into a legitimate combo. And just in case you need to know, a legitimate or true combo means that you hit someone, they are stunned from that hit, and you have another attack that's fast enough to hit them again before they're able to get out of that hit stun. You can activate a custom combo by hitting either 2 punches and a kick at the same time, or vice versa. All of these things combined made Alpha 2 such a unique beast of a fighting game for the time. There's just so many new ways to deal with a bunch of different situations in Street Fighter. And for people that just wanted to jump in and play with friends at home, these systems worked out really well for them too. You didn't really have to know any long combos to do any of these things. Experience and strict control can give you lots of good combos and opportunities, but enough button mashing would probably make some of these things come out too. Plus, people love new characters like Saddam, Guy, and even Rose and Sakura from Alpha 1 really caught on. And players even just warmed up to the spiffy new versions of classics like Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, and even though Guile wasn't fully featured, Charlie gave Guile players some of that familiar gameplay with a fresh face to see on screen. Competition was good. Game diversity was good. Fans were happy. It really couldn't get much better than this. What you?
Round 1.
Here you go. Oh yeah, thanks. Thank you. Ugh.
Challenge 2. New generation. Wow!
So look, unbeknownst to most Western players, or really most players in general, development on Street Fighter 3 began just shortly after Alpha 2 was released. The draw being the new Capcom Play System 3 arcade hardware. Using the spiffy new high-tech compact disc format, it boasted better graphics, sound, the whole 9 yards. Capcom went so far as to advertise that the goal with New Generation, and subsequently the CPS3, was to make games that were just plain unable to be ran on any modern home console. You would have to experience the newest generation of street fighting at your local arcade. And you listen here, if anyone's gonna tell you to go support your local arcade, it is this guy. But while having an arcade exclusive experience can be a neat thing to try out and maybe make arcade owners a decent return, that is a strong gamble. At the time, players were growing more and more detached from arcades. Home consoles were just starting to be more capable of running the same exact games. Even to a more limited extent, ports like Daytona USA were pretty dang playable compared to the arcade version. And this is coming from a guy that used to own a Daytona USA twin. I love Daytona, but I would much rather just play my Saturn or Dreamcast copy than go through the hassle of troubleshooting Sega Model 2 hardware ever again. He says, keeping the eBay alerts for Daytona on. Speaking of which, Capcom decided to opt for putting all their chips into fine-tuning and perfecting their sprite work for the next major Street Fighter, instead of just jumping headfirst into the realm of 3D. Sure, Street Fighter EX had been out for a while now, but that was more of an Eureka gig. Alpha 2 versus New Generation had to be digested completely differently. Even the way their game is advertised during the demo reels just give totally different vibes. Those demo reels were actually much more important than you think. Since arcades and arcade culture is something that I actually really take close to heart, I think it's kind of important that we talk about how those demo reels affected the perception that people had on these games. But you didn't talk about Alpha 3. Good. That's good. But that one has the online. That's unfortunate. I'm sorry. I feel bad. But Alright, look. Besides coming out a full year after New Generation, Alpha 3 kinda has some issues. Less so some of the busted stuff, you know, things like being too overpowered or just some jank like infinites. I don't mind any of that. I love the jank. Give me more of the jank. Put the jank into my Street Fighter. My issues with Alpha 3 has more to do with the mechanics and the flow of the game for starters. Beginning with the isms change. This could actually be a really fun concept, but I just don't think it fits in very well. Whenever you pick a character, you have a choice between A-ism, X-ism, or V-ism. This changes some of the character's behaviors and drastically changes the way that the super meter is used. In theory, its purpose is to make characters feel like they play from different games. With V-ism, this is meant to be your tool for using custom combos from Alpha 2. Only characters that are picked with V-ism can use this. This ism also divides the bar into sections, but just into 2. And even then, you can only activate a custom combo when your meter is at a minimum of 50%. In Alpha 2, this can be activated almost whenever. Another issue being, depending on which buttons you activated the custom combo with, it would change the speed in which your follow-up attacks connected. While this can lead to some interesting looking combos and connections, some of that infinite jank, I just think this made a really fun, simple mechanic overly complicated. Not that it's a horrible mechanic, it's just, this is kind of a prime example of too much of a good thing. It's just kind of not needed. Another new addition is the guard meter. This, again in theory, functions the same as a Dizzy in other Street Fighters, except now it has a visual representation. The issue here is that performing an alpha counter affects your guard meter. So, if you're in that situation where someone is being overly offensive to the point of being predictable and you punish them for solving their playstyle, you could be the one that gets punished. Yeah, sure, you still get your distance when you use it, and yeah, sure, you get some damage off, but you shouldn't be punished for being able to properly react or predict your opponent, at least not in my opinion. This also sucks because if you're constantly getting poked by this person, even if you're blocking, that affects your guard meter as well. Some characters also have attacks that take advantage of this much more effectively than others. So all the while you're constantly blocking this person's attacks, you recognize where the opening is and you go for the alpha counter. You're basically saying, he's really going for my guard meter here. Better finish the job for him. Oh, and by the way, it still uses some of your super meter. The original iteration of alpha counters made a very balanced risk-reward system when using them. Alpha 3 just puts them way too heavy on the risks and way too low on the rewards. I am totally fine with limiting an ability or a move if it's going to make something useful and unique. But just like the ism split, just like the different speeds of the custom combos, potentially good mechanics, just awful execution. Whew. And lastly, which this is probably my biggest issue and more of a personal taste issue as well, is overinflation. Alpha 3 has 26 characters, 29 if you count Julie, Junie, and Boxer, those 3 being secret characters in the arcade release. And the most up-to-date version on PSP has a massive 37 characters with all the post-arcade editions, but we're gonna focus on the arcade version. Alpha 2 has 18, much easier to digest and everyone feels unique.
Well, that must mean that you don't like Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Nah, I love Marvel 2. Marvel 2's dope. Marvel 2 is even worse with the inflation, clocking it at over 50 characters. Some of the ports of sprites really don't even look that good in Marvel 2, but that's fine, because Marvel 2 is nuts. The crazy gameplay style and the speed make up for the overabundance of characters. This game was designed to have so many characters on screen at a time that you probably see more super activations than you do the actual background of the stage. And yeah, sure, whenever you pick a character, you have to pick 3 different versions. But that really only affects the assist functionality, that being the action the character does when you call them into act while they actually aren't the active character. Yes, this changes how you have to play with the characters, but fundamentally it doesn't change any mechanics of your main controllable character. Now listen, I still think that you can have fun with Alpha 3, but when you mix in 29 characters with 3 different versions of the characters depending on the ism, not only does it start to get needlessly complicated, but it also severely widens the gap between characters that are extremely good and characters that severely underperform. Alpha 3 took something fun, simple, and instantly replayable because it had a fine balance of simplicity and complexity, and just made it bloated. Alpha 3 isn't really a bad game, it's just not a successor to Alpha 2. It's not an improvement. So, does that clear it up?
But if Alpha 3 isn't as good as Alpha 2, then why did Alpha 3 get the online?
Man, I don't know. These are the same people that decided they were going to put out a collection of Street Fighter games without a training mode until people got upset. Then decided to make training mode a day one patch. So if you ever go to buy a used copy one day and you got no internet, oops, no training mode. Moving on.
The Challenger.
You can always try again.
So getting back to those demo reels, these are actually much more important than some people think. The demo was essentially the clickbait of the arcade. That's the one thing that's gonna have to draw you in and then get you to put up that coin. Let's just go ahead and take a look at both of these games, Alpha 2 and New Generation. Alpha 2 just has so much more color and style, and the music just sets such a fun mood. All the new characters are right there on display, and the ending caps off with the classic Ryu and Ken throwing fireballs into the screen. That just looks like a good time. New Generation, on the other hand, it just kind of seems, The lack of color, the strange Resident Evil-esque narration at the end.
Street Fighter 3. New Generation.
It's just lacking some of that charm that draws me in like Alpha 2 does. Well, whatever. Feed the credits.
Street Fighter 3.
Hit start and 10 characters? Ryu and Ken being the only faces that you would immediately recognize. New Generation introduced a bunch of really unique and diverse characters, I'll give it that. But the point is, we have to get into the headspace of how people who frequented the arcade viewed their roster representation at the time. Alpha 2 featured a full cast of 18, 8 being returning characters with a complete makeover compared to SF2, and 9 if you want to count Charlie as the Guile substitute. Even previously released games like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, a precursor to the Marvel vs. Capcom series, had a roster of 17. Now, in defense of New Generation, you can make the argument that it was easier to make characters for Alpha 2 and X-Men, since the majority of their art was either taken from the last game they made, or in Marvel's case, there's lots and lots of source material to work from. To people who went to arcades though, it still just wasn't seen as a very fair trade. Think about it. Not only do you have to factor in the shared arcade space, plus the addition of what some players have done to improve their home sessions. You spend the past year getting good at something, going so far as to buy equipment and extras to improve outside of the home field, and then suddenly the rug is pulled out from under you for a totally different experience. Players had a pretty good reason to be upset. Not everyone had access to large arcades that had the floor space, budget, or either one to afford having more than one Street Fighter out at the time. Some arcade operators bought into that bait that the CPS3 would bring in the bucks with its improvements. Gotta keep the lights on, and for some operators, putting out a new game was the quick and easy solution. They didn't understand why it didn't work. You might get that quick coin from someone trying it out, but if it doesn't have that staying power and people turn back to older games, or even worse, stop showing up since you got rid of that old game for the newer one, then you aren't going to get that continuous return on your investment. That's the gamble that arcades had to make. Either way, for those that did accept or tolerate the change, they'd get some really great artwork, some great music, and they would be the first to try out what would be the building blocks of one of the best fighting games ever made. Speaking of building blocks, our variable supers were changed to selectable supers to simplify some of the gameplay. You could still save and store away multiple bars worth of supers, but they only ever have the one level and one type of use. You could also see how many you had stored away by a numerical value instead. You could argue that not letting a player use multiple different kinds of supers took away some strategy, but it moved the strategy to start outside of the game. Picking a super didn't change how the base character functioned, but it changed how you had to strategize moving in on your opponent. It forced both you and your opponent to think differently about how to play during a match without really changing anything about the characters. Yun's Ganajin super is clearly modeled after custom combos, so while taking away the ability for everyone to use custom combos, this gave the developers and the designers more freedom to work on a character who could base all of their attacks and animations around using this ability. You can make the argument that maybe this just takes away an option from other characters, sure, but at least in my opinion, it took a really great fun concept and used it to make something really unique and special. And gone were the alpha counters. Well, for the most part, parries are the reason to play Street Fighter 3. Now granted, the parrying system wouldn't be extremely polished until Third Strike, but parrying allowed you to completely stop an attack if you knew exactly what was coming and when. It's basically an advanced but risky block. It's the most flashy and impressive part of any of the Street Fighter 3 games, and this is a big proponent of why the game can be so fast and fluid. It takes no super meter, no guard meter. Parrying is basically a simplified but improved evolution of the alpha counter. In fact, if your opponent does multiple hits, you're expected to either parry more or just switch to block. But if you knew what was coming at you, much like knowing which directional counter to use for an alpha counter, you get the advantage and can punish them for either being too predictable with whatever combination of attacks you could think of. We got the first iteration of the universal overhead attack too, but it's kind of hard to explain why that's important unless we talk about some Street Fighter fundamentals, so we'll save that for later. But at the end of the day, New Generation just didn't have the right amount of appeal, the right speed, the right presentation, and it just didn't come out at the right time. On top of that, since Capcom either really wanted to put a band-aid on things or really wanted to make a quick check, we jump only about 8 months later to Street Fighter 3. 2. More specifically, Second Impact, Giant Attack. Second Impact definitely has a little bit more appeal than New Generation does in its demo. And if you take a good look, really dig in there, squint if you have to. There's gameplay in here. Who would have thought to actually show the most impressive part of Street Fighter 3? That's crazy. Give me that parry into Super Ryu. That's the stuff I want to see out of my Street Fighter 3. But really, you don't need gameplay in a demo for it to be attractive, but I think that this was the change that they needed to advertise better on the arcade floor. Like we've said, some of the mechanics in Street Fighter 3 are the reason to play Street Fighter 3. Let's show off the good stuff. It said, hey look, this is an alpha. This isn't Super Turbo. This is its own thing. Much like New Generation, Second Impact actually featured some pretty amazing artwork. I mean, look at this. And the stare down at the end with Alex and Hugo, I mean, that's pretty sick. Getting into the character select, it kinda eh. The character icons are pretty cool, I'll give it that, but I definitely liked the Earth effect of New Generation a lot more than this. Akuma's placement is actually pretty cool. Speaking of which, they added him back in. Akuma goes back to being both playable and a secret fight in the arcade mode. They even added a fight against Shin Akuma, a more powerful version of the character if you do well enough. More importantly, Second Impact added Hugo and Urien into the mix, serving as the giants in the title. They also separated Yang into his own character slot, and just like New Generation, we got some more great music. You're actually hearing it right now. And of course, a couple new and polished up mechanics. I'm trying to save a lot of the in-depth explanations when we get to Third Strike, but we also got our first taste of EX special moves. Fancy versions of special moves that cost a little meter, but come with some extra properties. Some could start up faster, some could be invincible for a little bit of time, some could just do more damage. Taunts finally came around. And also being able to do modern throw tags. Oddly enough, this is also one of the only games on the CPS3 to have an option for widescreen video. It doesn't really serve too much of a purpose outside of just looking cool, but if looking cool is all it's there for, then it does a really good job of that. The widescreen is usually turned off though, so while it's not really all that practical, it kinda sadly hides a lot of that great new background art. I kinda wanna stress this one more time. This update game came out in the short span of only about 7 or 8 months of work post New Generation. I mean, some bits of Hugo were already in New Generation, so some stuff for Second Impact was probably already prematurely in the works or just carried over from the development of that game. Either way, Second Impact is a hell of an improvement over New Generation. Not the best game in the Street Fighter 3 series, but it would definitely do since we had a little bit of a wait ahead of us.
Challenge 3.
Let's go.
So, we're a few months into our first official Marvel vs. Capcom bout, almost a year into the successor to Alpha 2, and an entire year past one of the sickest anime fighters debuts. Finally, we have Street Fighter 3, Third Strike, Fight for the Future. And of course, we gotta look at the intro.
Strike y'all in Street Fighter 3.
God, God, it's just so good. I know lyrics in video games tend to be kind of a mixed bag with people, but here, Infinite just sells the setting of Third Strike perfectly. We're kind of back to just doing some character portraits, but we keep some color and the music timing just creates this amazing mood around the machine. These game demos were practically supposed to be commercials, and this is a heck of an ad. Very few games just ooze that fun factor that Third Strike has right off the bat. Take for instance something like Captain Commando, another game made by Capcom. This one came out in 1991. If you got a friend, it's short, sweet, and it's pretty fun to just burn quarters through. But look at the intro. Yep, that's it. And don't try to tell me that people would want to play because of the artwork on the arcade machine. A lot of cabinets didn't have art. Oftentimes, the cheapest way for an arcade operator to get in new games was just to buy the board. It was way more expensive to order a whole new cabinet for one game. Why spend money on a new cabinet when A, you don't have the space on your arcade floor, and B, you have a game that people aren't playing anymore anyways? Just swap the games out. Not that I really blame them, I mean, I respect the grind. Just go type in Dynamo and arcade sometime and tell me how many junky conversions pop up. With a game like Captain Commando, long-running players would figure out the game and only have to spend a quarter or two to get through the entire thing. If a game ran its course like that and wasn't bringing in a constant return, it was often better financially to just swap it out. This is another reason why Street Fighter, or fighters in general, were so influential to arcade operators. They didn't really have to worry too much about the local players figuring out the game and being done with it, since figuring out the game was only half of the reason to play a fighter. Having to pay to challenge whoever's the better player is what kept people coming back. You gotta put up that next coin if you didn't want to be called a scrub. That's just how it went. The experience was fresh every time someone new stepped into play. More importantly, Third Strike was released a full year and a half after Second Impact. Not only was Capcom struggling to keep that competitive boom that Street Fighter II made alive, but now they were competing with themselves on multiple fronts. For starters, the impression that New Generation and Second Impact made kinda initially turned people off on Third Strike. Both Marvel vs. Capcom and Alpha 3 were out in arcades, and they both ran on the CPS2, the previous generation of Capcom arcade hardware. This made getting these games relatively cheaper for operators. Adding on to that, there's some technical specifics that make this even more difficult on them. We've talked about how some arcade operators would just swap out an old game for a new one, sure, but the CPS3 made things a lot more difficult. Two things kept operators on their toes. Well, actually, why bother telling you when I can just show you? Okay, so now we finally get to talk about one of my favorite parts of this series, the arcade hardware. This is my own personal CPS3 board, or at least just the PCB portion, and this is how it looked when I bought it. Let's get our hands free for just a minute. Oh, that's much better, and now I got some room to actually show you something. Oh, and don't worry about the hands earlier, I'm just a normal cartoon like the rest of you guys. So, since a lot of you guys watching may have either never dealt with any arcade hardware, or maybe this is your first time seeing some, we're gonna start with the absolute basics. Third Strike came out in 1999, and the CPS3 is a late 90s arcade board. So, therefore, it follows the JAMA standard. JAMA stands for Japan Amusement Machine and Marketing Association. JAMA was actually created and ran by a bunch of different representatives from a few really big names in video games. This came about around 1985, and before that, there wasn't really a standard for what kind of connections these arcade games would use. A company or a manufacturer could come out with an arcade game that had a separate board and wire set just for videos, and a separate board and wire set just for audios, and then a whole separate board just for controls. It was a little bit crazy. But now, with the JAMA standard, and notably a couple exceptions, all of our different connections and sources can come from this one edge connector, using what we'd usually call a JAMA harness. Board sets like the CPS2 and the CPS3 are usually referred to as JAMA Plus, however. Those little exceptions we talked about, or the plus in JAMA Plus, means things like our kick harness, or our stereo jacks here on the side. The JAMA Edge connector takes care of a bunch of different things. Both sticks for two different players, a bunch of different buttons for each player, our power, our mono, audio, things like that. However, like we said, the JAMA standard came about in 1985. Street Fighter 1 didn't even come out until 1987. They didn't exactly plan for two people to need 6 buttons each. The kick harness is just that. It's an extra harness that we connect up down here that gives both our player 1 and player 2 control sets all of their 3 kick buttons. All of our punches are already mapped to our JAMA pinouts. By default, our JAMA Edge connector actually outputs mono audio, so we can get audio just like that. But the CPS2 and CPS3 also have these RCA stereo jacks outside of the board, so that way you can output stereo audio. I'm gonna show you all of these hooked up real soon, but let's talk about some CPS3 specifics. Hands, if you will. Thank you very much. So, about those two things that kinda gave arcade operators a hard time. One of these things was the security cartridge, which usually goes in this port right here. Every game released for the CPS3 had its own unique security cartridge. Every game also came with a unique CD that had to be installed. The CD and the software itself would check the security cartridge to make sure you had the correct one in the board. Otherwise, it wouldn't start or it wouldn't install. This was meant to keep easily burnable and bootleg CDs from being circulated. And sadly, these carts also kinda acted like an expiration date. Every cart had a battery hard installed into it. When this battery eventually died out, the code for the security key for each game was lost with it. This means that if you had a working arcade machine, a working PCB, a working CD drive with a CD that was just fine, but your cartridge died, you still couldn't run your game. However, over the years, a couple really talented hobbyists have been able to kind of find a workaround for this. This is a reproduction security cartridge for the CPS3. And not only is it a reproduction and not just an old cartridge fixed up, it also contains the security keys for every game released for the CPS3. These are made in part by Darksoft and Mitsurugi. This modified security cartridge allows you to uninstall and reinstall any game made for the CPS3 with this one cartridge. You also don't have to worry about any batteries dying out on this board. So this will last you for a very long time. Wait, hands? Freeze? Oh, there we go. Our next little specific piece of hardware are these SIM cards up here. These SIM cards are basically expandable or upgradable flash memory. Whenever you install a new game onto your CPS3, this is where a majority of the game gets installed too. The reason that this made things kind of difficult on arcade operators is because these CPS3 SIM cards came in 3 different sizes, and every game required a different amount of memory to be installed. These 7 slots on these sides are where they can be installed, and only specific cards can be used in specific slots. There's a 32, 64, and 128 megabit. For every game on the CPS3, slots 1 and 2 should only ever have 64 megabit cards, slots 3 and 4 should only ever have 128 megabit cards, and then slot 5 and 6 can kind of depend. Some games will accept either a 32 megabit or a 128 megabit. Other games absolutely require you to have a 128 megabit card. The really difficult thing here is that most people that buy a CPS3 are getting it for Third Strike. Third Strike, being the last game that was released on the CPS3 and arguably the biggest game, requires the most SIM cards out of any other game. Slots 1 and 2 require a 64 megabit card, and then slots 3 through 6 require 4 different 128 megabit cards. For every game on the CPS3, the 7th slot is never used. You never really have to worry about that. The issue here is that these are proprietary cards. You can't just go onto eBay or go onto Newegg and then just buy some different third-party version of these SIM cards. You either need to get new, old stock, used SIM cards from a previous CPS3 board, or try to get reproduction SIM cards. And once again, you can thank Darksoft and Mitsurugi for making the reproductions on these possible too. However, just like the reproduction security carts, these are all made in batches, so occasionally you can miss your chance to get them. Let's talk about the last couple parts and then I'll get back to this. Just so that way everyone's still in the loop while we keep moving, we got a little 3D printed custom case for our security cartridge. All of the original cartridges shipped with their own label and case, so if you get a reproduction cartridge, it's not going to come with one. I definitely recommend you go ahead and pick one up just for safety. Next up, love it or hate it, is our CD drive. Most CPS3s originally used Panasonic model drives. Mine just happens to be a CR505. There really isn't too awful much to say here about these drives. The only thing I will tell you is that this is pretty old hardware, just like everything else we're talking about, so these are kind of prone to failure. However, this is a CD drive, so it's much easier to just go ahead and replace it with a different model or find a new old stock part. If you're planning on replacing your CD drive or getting a different model, there's just a couple things things you need to keep in mind. You need to make sure that these jumpers on the back of the drive are set to the correct positions for the CPS3, and for my people that are a little bit deeper in the arcade rabbit hole, if you intend on mounting the CPS3 and its CD drive vertically inside of your arcade machine, you need to make sure you pick up a replacement drive that is going to lock the CD into place when you put it in. It is possible to pick up a drive where it doesn't have this feature, and if you go to run that CD and it isn't locked into place, bad things happen. And since we're in the future, there's also a way to completely omit the drive if we'd like to, but that requires some more hardware and a little extra setup, so I'm gonna save that for its own video. So if you've been following along, we can kind of look at all the different things that kind of made this difficult. Assuming you already had a working arcade machine, all that good stuff, all the things you would need for the CPS3 are a new board set, the correct security cartridge, a working CD drive, and enough SIM cards to install whatever game you'd like to play. Back in the day, if an operator wanted to buy a new board, they just bought the board and hooked up the JAMA harness. It was simple. But now, if an operator bought a copy of New Generation and they wanted to upgrade to Second Impact, that would mean getting a different CD, a different security cartridge, and more SIM cards. And then if they wanted to get Third Strike after that, the process just repeats. It's not as simple as just getting a new board anymore. As far as getting a setup today goes, it's kind of even worse. CPS3 boards are expensive, and we're talking about boards that could possibly still have old carts, dead carts, whatever. This system did not have very many games at all. It had an exclusive that's never been ported to any other console at the time of making this, the JoJo fighting games, and the entire Street Fighter 3 series. That's it. Even though it's not a lot, there's a lot of gems there, so it's a pretty sought after board. So after finally finding and paying for a board which hopefully is working with a CD drive, you would need to then get enough sims to run Third Strike. Since you can't just buy any kind of third-party sims, at least not directly, you would either have to get in line for the new batches of reproductions or get more CPS3 boards just to harvest sim cards from. Then, after you finally get enough sims, you'd have to have a security cartridge that's actually able to run and install the game, which if you have an old cartridge, that means you either have to pay someone to actually fix it for you, or you have to do a battery swap, which means desoldering and resoldering a new battery while the game is on. Or you can just omit all that and buy another reproduction cartridge, but that's also not cheap. Obviously, you don't have to get all this just to play Third Strike, but people like me do it for the love of the game. The CPS3 is a great system, it just wasn't executed very well. Third Strike was the final revision of a game that already didn't have a great reputation, was way more expensive for arcade operators to get, and was put out at a time where many other fighting games were out and took up, quite literally, valuable floor space in arcades. All the while, the Naomi system was out there. That came around in 1998 and was basically just a Dreamcast in an arcade format. This system had a bunch of influential games that came out not long after Third Strike, like both Capcom vs. SNKs, Power Stone, and freaking Marvel vs. Capcom 2.
Capcom presents.
Third Strike basically was the Sega Saturn of fighting games. People either went all in on their Sega Genesis and stuck it out with the old stuff, or they just held off and waited for a Dreamcast. Or I guess technically it would be a PS2. That's what most people did, but I don't know. I love my Dreamcast. I don't care. Fuck you. And just like the Saturn, lots of people look at it now and can point out all these great games that just kind of got brushed over or didn't come out in their region. But with all that being said, with all these other great games being out already that are bringing in enough of a return and more big games on the horizon, why even bother making a third Street Fighter 3 game? Well, just like the people that still play Third Strike today, a few people at Capcom knew they just couldn't give up on something this special.
Challenge. Throw. Fight for the future.
While Capcom did get some new staff for Third Strike, a vast majority of the team were returning developers from Second Impact. One team member would actively attend local events for Second Impact in the East, and would constantly be impressed by the movement of high-level players, even going on to say that players made the fights look like these beautiful, organized dances. This directly led to the new grading system in Third Strike. It would observe your play throughout the matches, it would actually give you a letter grade for how impressive you were. A bunch of factors actually went into this grade, but ultimately, it gave players a neat, visible goal to go for, other than just some arbitrary number score. And players of Second Impact were huge fans of the new additions when they did some location tests, both in the West and in the East. Chun-Li, a fan favorite returning fighter, completely redesigned for Street Fighter 3. They created Chun using almost none of her original design documents from Street Fighter 2, so this is a really fresh version of Chun-Li compared to any other game. Makoto, the Iken Hisatsu-inspired karate student, a totally new fighter, and while slow and precise in her movements, she is extremely powerful, and even without a projectile can be dangerous from any distance. 12. After the creation of Chun-Li and Makoto, 12 was designed to contrast the two's smooth physical designs and fighting styles with some crazy transformations and super warped special attacks. Remy, another contrast character. For one, he brings back some of that guile familiarity that Street Fighter 3 was lacking, but more importantly, he was designed with a more beautiful aesthetic. Remy was designed the way that he was because they thought his personality and art direction was missing from the roster. Q, the new mystery challenger. He was basically meant to be the new Akuma from ST, someone you can only fight if you met certain conditions in the arcade mode. His story and personality are purposefully strange, leaving most of his backstory and reason for being up to interpretation. Another slow but really bulky character in the right hands. He kind of plays like a fat, clumsy kid, super fun to see played well. Oh, and he explodes! The development team closely watched over the initial location tests and were constantly making changes before the final release, going so far as to follow dedicated Japanese players' homepages online, players who would actively post about their experiences with the location tests and what their thoughts were on the current game. They actually went on to admit that Second Impact came out relatively unpolished. The overall goal of Third Strike was to make a game specifically for people who loved fighting games. It was meant for those arcade rats and the home grinders that played these games into the ground. Noritaka Funamizu, a producer for Third Strike, speaks a little bit in depth on Capcom's passion for the game. It's always been our development ethos, to make quality games that are both affordable for operators to purchase and will return them a steady income. I also firmly believe that for game centers to continue to exist in the long run, they must continue to have traditional video games. However, I'm sad to say this, but many of the operators who have bought our games, the moment that music and large arcade machines start becoming popular, they abandoned traditional video games and only bought those machines. Despite our long relationship, they turned a cold shoulder to us. And many of those operators still don't recognize the value of video games, even though buying nothing but those machines for the last 2 to 3 years hasn't saved their business. Games like Alpha 3 and Marvel 2 are made to be a little bit more inviting to new players, and arcade operators initially wanted this. They wanted more new players to come in at the time, get people off their home systems and into the arcade. They liked that inviting nature. They wanted companies like Capcom to keep making games that would keep bringing in new faces. But in the case of Third Strike, Capcom just didn't quite see eye to eye. They thought, don't you need something for the serious players? The ones that are gonna keep coming back? Small-time operators needed those games. Fun, replayable games played a huge part in building up these communities, and those communities are what kept some of these rural arcades afloat. They changed some mechanics and added some overall control improvements to help invite players back in. Character additions like Chun-Li were made to re-entice that legacy crowd to jump back into Street Fighter again. But overall, Third Strike was polished into the game that it is today because they understood the importance of trying to cater to the returning audience of arcades. Think about how you might be treated differently every time you go back to a restaurant. That arcade is going to rely on you being a returning customer just as much as that little mom and pop Italian place is. Arcade ops wanted what was hot. The crane game wave and rhythm game fever taken away from these classic titles with real, fundamental gameplay. Capcom didn't want to believe that these new trends is what would save arcades. They needed something for the dedicated players. When they were developing Third Strike, they were striving to satisfy those faces that would come back in and day out. The fear of a world where arcades and game centers were reduced to photo booths, crane games, and carnival gimmicks is what Capcom was envisioning. And if you take a good look at the kinds of modern arcades we have today, oh, they were right. Third Strike wasn't just another fighting game. Third Strike wasn't just a love letter to people that love fighting games. Third Strike was a game that was made for people who are passionate about these games, and was made with the intention to help support arcades at the start of one of the industry's hardest moments. The same communities where these dedicated people played every day, made friends and grew stronger and supported each other in these games. Street Fighter 3 Third Strike was a fight for the future.
Welcome to the world of Street Fighter 3.
Well, we're not done just yet. We've talked about a lot so far, and hopefully after all of that, it's a little bit easier to appreciate the game for more than just being a game. But we've still got to learn how to play.
Challenge 5. Prepare for battle.
But well, how are we gonna play it? This is a question that gets asked a lot with this game. Third Strike is a relatively old game by today's standards. There's been lots of different ports and releases, so which one is the best version has been talked about since the original console ports. To start things off easy, the absolute best way that you can play is on a legitimate arcade setup. The whole cabinet, genuine Japanese controls, a real tube TV, the works. If you have access to a local or even semi-local arcade, Go play. Support it. Not everyone has access to an arcade or the funds for that kind of setup though. So what's the next best option? Well, there's technically a correct answer, but let's just get the versions that you shouldn't play out of the way. By today's standards, it's probably for the best if you avoid the Dreamcast, PS2, and original Xbox versions. To put it simply, they aren't as accurate to the arcade versions as they could be, so they're really not worth investing the time or money into for practicing at home. Third Strike is an arcade game, and if you want to go out and play with other people, you'll hopefully be able to play on the arcade version. So the goal is to practice and play on a version that's going to be as close to the original as we can get. Aside from in-game differences, if you don't already own them, you would have to buy the game, pick up a console secondhand since mainstream stores don't always carry a lot of these systems, and on top of that, get a controller that's fit for playing Street Fighter. And no, I'm not just gonna brush over controls, we'll cover that real soon. Now on to a couple of the good ways to play. First up, emulation. Right now, the two best emulation methods that have online play is gonna either be Fightcade 1 or Fightcade 2. Sadly, Fightcade 2 is actually on hiatus right now as a project, so there isn't much to expect in the way of support right now if something starts going south. I'll definitely try to put up something if that changes though. You can still technically download and use Fightcade 2 right now, but Fightcade 1 is still around and active, so that's usually the preferred version of Fightcade to use. Although, being emulations of the arcade version, they require you to have your own copy of Third Strike in a format that Final Burn Alpha, the emulator that Fightcade uses, accepts.
Now, how exactly you plan on obtaining and ripping the data off of a CPS3 setup is kinda up to you, wink wink.
Fightcade is also PC only, obviously, in case that needed to be cleared up. Like we said, Third Strike's an old game, so it's not like you really need the best PC specs to play it either. This can be both a blessing and a curse, since you'll have to configure Fightcade and FBA to your system, and connect with people who might have vastly different systems, there can be some discrepancies. Fightcade 1 is also a little aged in and of itself, being designed originally for Windows XP. There can be some issues you'll have to work around with using modern operating systems on top of it. And just as a little word of warning, the chat on Fightcade is kind of, notoriously unmoderated? Unfiltered? I guess that's the best word for it. All in all, Fightcade is a really nice solution, and there's almost always people on to play, except sometimes the quality is perfect, and sometimes it's just unplayable with certain people. Final Burn Alpha also has a pretty great training mode mod. There's only one or two things you won't understand if you don't speak Japanese. Here's the important bit though. Modern console ports, starting with the online edition release from Iron Galaxy on PS3 and Xbox 360. This release is semi-faithful to the arcade version, but it does do some neat things like add Gil as a playable character, and they remove some negatives like Ken's neutral throw glitch. This glitch being where if you threw Makoto in between one of her supers, it would do this. Or sometimes even just crash the whole game, which is just great. The arcade release of Third Strike actually had two different revisions, and this version makes sure to use the first one. The first and most common revision is basically the standard for tournament play. This is the revision that allows Urien to do some of the crazy unblockable setups that he's known for. There's really only one other version of Third Strike though as far as arcade hardware is concerned, so unless you actually own a board and want to look into installing the first version of Third Strike, you really don't have to worry about having the wrong version. Just about every version that you'll find in the wild has the original, correct version. However, back on track, there are a few negatives to Online Edition. For one thing, Online Edition has only ever been released as a digital download. Obviously, that means that you'll need an internet connection if you'd ever like to purchase this game for yourself. The game has also been patched over time, and there's been a couple convenient fixes. There were some issues with some meter sizes not being completely accurate to the arcade version, and they also fixed a couple very rare crashes along the way. It's minor stuff, but if you have an old revision installed and you now do not have an internet connection, you won't be able to update to the best version of the game. More importantly, there's currently still a small issue with Yun. Yun is known for being a very combo-heavy character, and one of his best starters is his command grab. In Online Edition, this command grab doesn't scale as accurately to the arcade version as it should, so every move that you do following this command grab doesn't scale properly in terms of stun and damage. It also builds more meter after using it than the arcade version would. While this doesn't make Online Edition impossible to play, far from it, it is a little bit rough to deal with, since in the arcade version, Yun's already known for being a pretty strong character in the right hands. Other than that, there's just been some small audio issues here and there. I've had some experiences where I'm playing online and the background music will just kind of stop, but that's much more of a minor inconvenience. Some of the best things about Online Edition is actually the training mode and the huge collection of music tracks, especially if you're considering the DLC too. They added Second Impact and New Generation music. The new UI and the extra music are really nice additions, but they're able to have all this because it's not an arcade port. The original arcade game actually runs at a refresh rate of about 59.583 Hz. which means it's not really possible to get that perfect 60 frames per second. For Online Edition, regardless of your monitor's refresh rate, it's locked at 60 FPS. It's very, very subtle, but the game does in fact run slightly faster than the original arcade game. If you're playing locally offline, there isn't any real difference in the PS3 and Xbox 360 versions, which is great. Playing online, however, it's a little bit different. The online infrastructure for the Xbox 360 is just built a little bit better than the PS3's. So in turn, the Xbox 360's version online tends to be just a little bit more stable. That isn't to say it's unbearable to play online on PS3, and just like every other game you're gonna play on the internet, it's gonna kinda come down to who you're playing with and where they are and their connection. And that's not really a jab at the PS3 version of Online Edition, it's more so just the Xbox 360's online is better than the PS3's online. Not really a jab, just the facts. There's also a good chance that your modern controller for PS4 works just fine on PS3, so there's definitely an advantage there for going back. Since these consoles have the option, if you're able to, try to get your hands on some component video cables and try to play on a CRT too. This will be that little extra step that'll help simulate that arcade version. Again, subtle, small differences, but we're looking for that arcade accuracy. I don't really recommend you use these releases for tournaments though, unless it's your only option. Mostly just because of how popular Yun is to play, the damage discrepancy doesn't really suit tournaments. However, I definitely recommend you pick up this version if you're looking for a great, cheap training mode. Online Edition actually has this really great trial mode which helps you practice a bunch of different kind of parries, combos, and character-specific situations. It's kind of worth it for the remixes of the music alone, honestly. Although now we're moving on to the big one. Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection. There's a lot to talk about here, so I think it's for the best if I just go ahead and start with one of the most daunting things both about getting into Third Strike and getting the 30th Anniversary Collection. The input lag. In short, input lag is the time between or number of frames passed between when you pressed a button and when the action that corresponds with that button appears on the screen. Without getting extremely technical, CRT or tube TV setups with arcade boards are the standard. Good, hardwired CRT setups have 0 to next to no input lag. Offline, the Online Edition games have roughly 2 frames of input lag. 30th Anniversary has around 2.5 to 3 frames of input lag. 30th Anniversary's Third Strike is also strictly an arcade port, minus fixing that Ken Makoto neutral throw glitch. They did make sure to take that out. Otherwise, it is strictly just the original arcade data, whereas Online Edition is not. But as far as the lag goes, we're talking about actual fractions of seconds worth of differences here. Is it unimportant? I mean, no, it really is important, but this is just the truth of the matter. It's fractions of seconds. What this really comes down to is forming habits and adaptability. Many great players originally practiced and played on the PS2 and Xbox versions back in the day, and carried their skills over to the arcade version, just polishing up at home. Fighting games, and especially Third Strike, really rely on your reaction speeds. So when you start building up these habits and you get good practices with your character, and then you need to make those split-second reactions, at the end of the day, those differences do become pretty important. It's not really worth yelling about which version to play and not playing the game in general, but for high-level play and for tournament play, it is important. So, should major tournaments be ran on 30th Anniversary? I mean, no. Probably not. Most tournaments will probably always be ran on legitimate original hardware for as long as we can make it last, or until an actual 100% arcade perfect solution comes around. However, is it a good version to start on and practice with? Yes, absolutely, at least I think so. I personally didn't really pick up Third Strike until I found it at an arcade long after its prime, but still years before 30th Anniversary came out. I traveled out to play that version as much as I could, but at home, I was limited to PC and Online Edition. It treated me just fine, and now 30th Anniversary treats me just fine. I personally never go back and forth from the arcade to 30th and whine when I take an L on a cab saying, God, I only lost since 30th isn't perfect. That's just dumb. Yes, it's not perfect, but most of the good things in Third Strike, and in most fighting games in general, come down to match knowledge, execution, and muscle memory. One big thing people are concerned about when the issue of input lag comes up is being able to get their confirms correct. If you've ever watched some high-level tournament Third Strike, you've probably seen Chun-Li do this. This could be a confirm. This could also just be them hitting the button and then mashing out the super, but that's a totally different issue. A confirm, like this, is being able to see or hear your character getting a successful hit on your opponent and then reacting to the hit by doing the next action, in this case, a super move. But you could also say the same thing about the opposite. If the attack was blocked, they have confirmed that it was blocked, so they decide to not perform the super. We have a whole how to play to get into, so I'll try not to go too deep into this right now. If you start on the arcade version of Third Strike, on a board and in a cab, and that's the only version you play and practice on, confirms are going to be hard to learn anyway. They're going to be hard to learn and get right in any real game. And you know what? they're gonna be even harder when you actually play a real tournament match or if you do go online. With enough time, you will do them. I believe in you, I have faith, but you're not gonna be able to do them right away no matter what version you start on. In my opinion, 30th Anniversary is extremely playable and accessible, and that's about the best that you can ask for if you're picking up an old game like Third Strike. The other negatives of 30th Anniversary, probably just the UI. It isn't always the most intuitive, and the lobby system for multiplayer can be a little lacking. Otherwise, I think this release is worth being supported. It's a great way to pick up the game for the first time. And for veterans, this is a way to vote with your wallet. If you're a Third Strike veteran who doesn't like 30th Anniversary, you don't want to buy the game and support it because it isn't 100% arcade perfect, then I understand. Your opinions are valid. But if you love Third Strike, I think that you should buy this and support it regardless. My reason being is that supporting and buying this collection is showing Capcom that you want more Third Strike going forward. The only way that they'll ever understand. With a paycheck. If you don't buy a game because of X or Y problem, or because it doesn't have an X or Y specific feature, a company very rarely recognizes that and tries to fix it. In the grand scheme of things, it's more likely that Capcom looks at the sales of 30th Anniversary Edition and tells themselves, well, they aren't buying Third Strike now, they aren't gonna wanna buy Third Strike later. Not to say that you shouldn't speak up though. If a game has issues or it isn't up to a community standard like the Street Fighter series has, be loud, voice your grievances, say something. Just try to be polite about it, and do it in a way that shows Capcom that you just want to help Third Strike and see it grow and improve in the future. So in conclusion, the only platforms you should be concerned with are arcade, emulation with your own data, and then console ports. However, again, these are just the only options you should really concern yourself with. I've already said enough about why 30th Anniversary is important for Third Strike, so I think that regardless of what version you play the most, you should get a copy of 30th Anniversary. Even if you don't use it, you're showing that you want more official Third Strike in the future the best way that you can. Next up, let's talk about controllers. Since the vast majority of major tournaments that host Third Strike play on official hardware and in an arcade machine, I'm gonna highly recommend that you play with a fight stick that either has Sanwa or Seimitsu parts, those being brands that make joysticks and buttons for arcade hardware. A lot of off-the-shelf fight sticks also come with these same brands, just keep a lookout for the names.
However, this is a whole new era we live in.
You got people playing Guilty Gear with steering wheels. We are in a new world, people. Quite frankly, I think that if you can get it to work on a PS4, you should play Third Strike with it. Some of the best fighting game players in the world play on a plain PS4 DualShock. If you want to do that with Third Strike, more power to you. If anything, and this is coming from someone that vastly prefers playing on an arcade with traditional arcade controls, I hope more arcade cabinet owners install more modifications into their machines in the future to allow for different controls. With devices like the undammed USB decoder, you can use just about any widely available controller for modern consoles with real arcade hardware. It would be amazing if more arcade operators adopt these parts into their machines to open up the barrier of entry to Third Strike. If someone comes up to me trying to play some Third Strike and they plug in a DDR dance pad, dude, I am down. Run the set. I'm here to play. But again, I've just gotta warn you ahead of time. There are still some tournaments that will only ever exclusively use arcade cabinets with the pre-installed controls. You might be gatekept from playing at some events or locations if you don't want to or aren't able to use those traditional controls. Additionally, I think it's worth noting that if you're playing on a modern console, chances are the monitor that you're using has an HDMI input, and that's just fine to play Third Strike.
Is it the ultra low lag PC monitor the tournaments might have?
I mean, no, probably not, but it should suit your needs just fine to jump in. This one's really important though. Regardless of what version you're playing on, if you're going to play online, please use a wired Ethernet connection. I really don't care if, but everything looks fine on my end when I use Wi-Fi. It's really not good enough. Long story short, wired connections can give faster, more reliable speeds. What might look great on your end could be awful for the other player if you're on Wi-Fi. What you might think is just the game's or console's poor performance could just be your unstable connection. Please use a wired connection for fighting games.
But GD, my router and or modem isn't in the same room that I want to play Third Strike.
Look into getting a power line internet adapter. Just plug your router into the adapter into the wall, a second adapter into the room that you want to play your games in, and then you can get an Ethernet connection from that room from that adapter. If you plan on picking up Third Strike for Nintendo Switch, please pick up the Ethernet adapter as well. But that clears up everything you really need to know about which version to play and what to play with. And before we move on, if I can be at least a little bit corny for a minute, outside of all the versions you can play, the different ways that you can start playing the game, the most important thing is that you play in general, and you have a good time while you're doing it. Don't let anyone tell you you're playing the wrong version or that you're playing the game wrong. Just worry about having fun and enjoy the game. If you got everything ready, go ahead and turn on your system, grab your controller, and let's learn some Third Strike.
Challenge 5.
Into the heat of battle.
All right, so let me just get some things out here. Hang on.